Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, welcome to the stormy season. To help us navigate this is a returning champion, a true voice of wisdom, a professor for all Americans, and a great friend of the show, and maybe one of the best grandpas I know. The great and powerful Joe Cirincione is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, my friend.
Paul, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm really glad you could fit this in. We had another guest who is scheduled to join us from Ukraine, who is frankly caught up in combat, and you have been great enough to come in and join us again, which is, I think, perfect timing because we've got so much to talk about with the reemerging, rising nuke threat. We've got Ukraine unfolding. But before we get to that, I want to ask you the question I ask of everyone: where are you, and how are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm at my son's house taking care of his 5-month-old boy while he and his wife are at work. So therefore I am great. I love spending this time. I love being selectively retired. It gives me time to do things like this. It's a pleasure. It's a joy.
I think we talked about this last time. You know, you would be a great dinner guest, but you've got to be an awesome grandpa. And for folks who are watching, there's a guitar behind you, there's a piano behind you, there may be a 5-month-old screaming behind you at some point. But you're such a valuable voice for this country, and I'm glad you could come to talk to us now. Because I think stakes are high again, Joe.
Yes.
You've got a great piece in the Washington Post. It came out a couple of days ago that I think lays out the nuke threat. Can we start at the top here? Because last time you came to us, it was in March. The war was just starting. Things have gotten a lot worse, a lot more dangerous, and it seems like the nuke threat is more prevalent than ever. But shape it up for us. Where are we on the macro, and specifically with regard to the nuke threat from Putin and Ukraine?
Sure, there have been multiple phases of this war. Putin's failed immediate offensive, couldn't capture Kyiv, he had to back off. Then he retreated to trying to capture the Donbass region. That is failing. And that brings us to this phase where it appears that Putin is losing the war. And that's where this could get very dangerous. Putin has got a lot committed to this war. His image, his prestige, his aura of invincibility, and that is now cracking, and you're seeing fissures develop in multiple areas in Russian society, among the Russian leadership. Morale among his troops is at rock bottom, and we hear lots of mill bloggers in Russia complaining about this. And so therefore he's starting to raise the stakes. He's trying to do everything he can to prevent defeat, including renewed nuclear threats. He made these kinds of threats in the beginning. It was the shield behind which he thought his offensive would succeed. And now it might be the shield that he hopes will prevent his defeat. He's warning the West, he's warning Ukraine that he will use nuclear weapons, not just to defend Russian territory, but to defend the territory in Ukraine that he's now annexing. He just had these fraudulent referenda in Ukraine this week. He's announced just today, while we're recording this, that there's between 80 and 95% approval. Obviously, absurd figures. Approval from the population to join Russia. So now his plan is to annex these oblasts, these provinces, none of which he fully controls, and in so doing, he will declare them Russian territory, and therefore any attack on these territories are an attack on Russia, and that allows him to use nuclear weapons. Long-standing part of Russian doctrine, they will use nuclear weapons to defend their territory, and that gets us right at the tip of the use of nuclear weapons. We're probably closer to seeing the use of nuclear weapons than we have been at any intentional time since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's powerful, and I'm glad you put a button on it at the end. And I want to go through the 4 scenarios you lay out in your piece in the Post. But before we get to that, I think there's one piece that I want to ask you to pull apart because I think it's important. I look back on the show description for March, and I wrote, Ukraine can win this thing. I wrote that in March. Others, you and others have been tracking on this. I think a lot of folks underestimated the Ukrainians, but we also didn't underestimate Putin. And we knew Putin probably could invade. He would do things like a draft. Everything that people think Putin might not do, he will do, right? And he has a different value set. But the point I want to ask you to drill down on is when you say nukes are a part of the Russian doctrine, can you explain what that means in terms of how they train, how they drill, and how they think?
Sure. Nuclear weapons are an integral part of Russia's strategic planning. So they aren't just a weapon of last resort. They aren't just there to deter other countries from attacking them with nuclear weapons. They are to be used in conventional battles. They have a first use doctrine. They're willing to use these first in a conventional battles. So does the United States. And the strategies are not dissimilar, but Russia goes deeper into this. They have something that they call escalate to de-escalate, or some would call it escalate to win. That is, if they're losing a conventional war, they will use nuclear weapons to signal to the opponent that the stakes are this serious and they're willing to go all the way in the hopes that the opponent backs down. And they regularly practice this doctrine. The U.S. does integrated nuclear conventional drills too, every once in a while, a couple times a year. Every major conventional exercise that the Russian military has performed, including just before the invasion of Ukraine, includes scenarios where they use nuclear weapons. So this is real. They're dedicated to this. They have weapons designed for these kinds of scenarios. And we're now at that point where we could see Putin in various ways use a nuclear weapon first in the hopes of preventing his defeat.
And well, I will put a pause and say, if your grandson wakes up and we need to pause, we can do that because that's another kind of signal that I know you're listening for. But let's talk about the four scenarios because I think this is important. I think most laymen, most civilians think that it's all or nothing, right? It's war games or the day after, some apocalyptic movie you've seen when every warhead gets launched and we're all dead in a nuke winter, right? But you lay out a couple of scenarios that are of an escalating scale. And the first one you talk about is a demonstration shot. Can you talk about what that is and what that means?
Right. So there are, there's lots of scenarios and lots of variations, but they fall into four broad categories. And the first is a demonstration shot. And the Russian doctrine explicitly talks about this. So they would fire a nuclear weapon into a largely uninhabited area, say over the Black Sea. And the purpose of that is to show their seriousness. Now, remember, if a nuclear bomb goes off, this would be the first time we'd seen a nuclear weapon in 77 years. The whole world would stop. This would become what everybody was talking about. We haven't even seen an above-ground nuclear explosion since the last atmospheric test done by China in 1980. So this is, rare. This would be a shock. And the U.S., some in the U.S., particularly the scientists in the Manhattan Project, proposed just such a demonstration shot at the end of World War II. Instead of bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they proposed a demonstration shot to show what they had in the hopes of getting the adversary to retreat. I think this is unlikely, however, for the very reason the U.S. military rejected it in 1945. As shocking as it is, it's not shocking enough.
And, the likely response would not be for us to fire a missile at Moscow, right? It would be increased sanctions. It would be a tougher talk, but we wouldn't respond in kind with some kind. We could respond with a warning shot of our own, maybe. I don't know if that's in the scenario planning, but they wouldn't likely hit Russia because they sent off this warning shot. But the next level of escalation that you talk about is a low yield weapon, right? Can you talk about going up this ladder from warning shot now to low yield? What comes next, Joe?
Sure, and that's the other half of the analysis. What is the U.S. response to this? And you can be sure that our military and intelligence and political leaders have been studying this since the beginning of the war. We know they have. There are press reports about this, and they're looking at all the scenarios and preparing response packages. And those response packages, just like you say, Paul, it's not automatically go nuclear. In fact, it's probably automatically don't go nuclear because the U.S. does not want to get into nuclear escalation. They fire, we fire, they fire more back. back. We have to. You're trying to avoid that. So you're trying to have escalation control. So in the case of a demonstration shot, there may not even be a military response. It could be increased military aid to Ukraine. It would absolutely be harsh sanctions. It would almost automatically result in Russia's international isolation. Even China and India would back off from him, for example. So you could see that kind, again, trying to control it, trying to prevent Putin from taking any further steps. But if he doesn't go demonstration shot, if he actually does a nuclear attack, he has various options. Probably the most likely option is a low-yield nuclear weapon used on a Ukrainian military target, a port, an airfield, a troop concentration. And they could use some of the weapons they have in their arsenal, including the Iskander missile, the ground-launched cruise missile, which has already seen extensive use in Ukraine with a conventional warhead that is already equipped with a nuclear mode, where they have a warhead on there that can go down as low as 10 kilotons. So a relatively small nuclear weapon. It's still an extremely large explosion. That's 10,000 tons of TNT, or about 20,000 of our standard conventional bombs, our 1,000-pound bombs. Imagine 20,000 of those dropping in one place at one time, and you get a sense of the power of that device. But that would kill, depending on the target, hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. But for nuclear weapons, a relatively small physical and body count for a nuclear weapon. And the hope, again, would be that you would stun Ukraine into surrender. You would stun the West. You'd back it off. And a lot of the West would say, okay, that's it. We're out, right? So that's the point to that. To counter that, the response from the U.S. would likely be what we just said, and for the demonstration shot, plus perhaps conventional military attacks on the unit that launched that weapon. You would see, substantial U.S. aid flowing in. The trick would be, does U.S. and NATO come in directly now, or do ground troops start to flow into Ukraine? That would be the kinds of decisions you're trying. But again, the U.S. and Russia have sufficient conventional forces, precise, accurate conventional forces, that they could devastate any targets they chose. They wouldn't have to go nuclear.
And going along this terrifying ladder of escalation, next up is a large yield weapon, right? And can you explain what that means and what that would look like, Joe?
Right. So the warhead I described on the Iskander, for example, and there's multiple missiles that are equipped with these, plus airdropped units, and these are all short, medium-range delivery vehicles. So something suited for battlefield conditions. That warhead on the Iskander has a low yield of 10. It has an upper yield of 100. So now you're looking at 3, 4, 5 times the size of Hiroshima. This would be a major blast. Now you start causing casualties, at least in the thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. If you might drop that, if he chose, on a city. If he hit Kyiv to try to decapitate the leadership, for example, that would be a stunning attack. The most destruction we've ever seen on a city since the end of World War II. And that would almost certainly provoke a major U.S., maybe NATO, and we can talk about this, the difference, maybe NATO response with a massive, at least conventional assault on Russian targets. And the idea would be to intimidate, to deter Putin from doing this again. So again, we have conventional options here. You'd start to hear talk among some of the military leaders, some of the political leaders, arguing for a response in kind, for a nuclear response. I think the indications are from the Biden administration and from the military leadership, they would prefer not to go nuclear if they could avoid it.
Does that mean they would empower Poland or someone that's more in the line of fire on NATO to be a forward edge of some kind of a response and still try to keep themselves at a distance. And this is obviously an apocalyptic kind of scenario, but it's real now, right? I mean, this is they're gaming this out in the Pentagon right now. They're gaming this out at NATO, and they've got literally multiple
Right.
scenarios on the board
Right.
based
Right.
off what happens, right?
Right, and here's what you're struggling with. If you're not going to surrender, which is what Putin wants, well,
Right.
what do you do exactly? And how do you control the escalation? How do you prevent this from going, as Joe Biden has said frequently, we're not going to fight World War III in Ukraine? How do you stop that from happening? So that's the trick, and that's what you're weighing. And in some ways, it's not a moral judgment of whether we should use nuclear weapons or not, although I would argue that that should be part of the consideration. It's a practical military consideration. If I do this, what are the odds that Putin will back down? What are the odds that he'll escalate? And that's why you want to try as much as you can to keep it at the conventional level. And we could do that. You know, many people have gamed this out. If the U.S. and NATO were to intervene, we have enough conventional forces that we could wipe out the Russian forces in Ukraine in a matter of days. We could knock out their command structures. You know, we could stop them. We could roll them all the way back to the border. And that's before you consider taking out targets in Russia itself.
Okay, now the worst case scenario of this, gruesome foursome here would be a nuke attack on NATO. You describe it as the least likely scenario, but part of Russia's doctrine, right? It's in their playbook. Can you talk about what a full nuke attack on NATO by Russia would look like?
Right. So suppose you saw something like a 100 kiloton or 50 kiloton weapon drop on Warsaw or on Paris. And Medvedev, top advisor to Dmitry Medvedev, a top advisor to Putin, has said just 2 days ago that if we use a nuclear weapon, the West will not respond. They care more about Paris, London, and Brussels than they do about Ukraine. So they're thinking this, right? So the reason I say it's a last resort is that I think in Putin's thinking, this is probably his second strike. This is the highest risk strike. You do this, and you are absolutely going to get what Biden has called a catastrophic response. You're going to get all the tools at their disposal, up to nuclear and maybe even nuclear. In the councils of government, there would be serious pressure to use a nuclear weapon to respond in kind, as they say. And some would argue you need to do that to preserve deterrence. You can't allow a NATO country to be hit by a nuclear weapon and not respond with nuclear force. And others would be arguing, as they have in war games, so we know this, that it's better to respond with conventional. That gives us more control of the escalation. But this is now you're right at the nuclear brink. Because if you did make that decision to go nuclear itself, well, all bets are off, really.
Right.
You don't know. You're no longer in control. You don't know what Putin's going to do next. And a lot of war games start off with just this scenario, a Russian first strike on NATO, and they escalate quickly and devolve into a global thermonuclear war. So this is where it gets real dicey. And for that reason, I think it's the least likely, but you can't rule it out. There's still a chance Putin might take that risk.
Joe, we'll link to the piece you wrote in the Washington Post in the show notes, but you wrote, these are horrible scenarios to consider. If you're worried, you're having the appropriate reaction. And we say a lot in this show, stay vigilant, be informed, understand the landscape. Can I ask you about two variables that I want to know about?
Yeah.
Number one, what's to stop Ukraine from pursuing Putin in Russia? Right? Like if they say we want to try him for war crimes, we want to hold leadership accountable, everybody assumes Ukraine's going to stop at the border and say, okay, we're done. There may be, a drive toward actually capturing or killing Putin. We've now seen there's a pipeline attack. This is expanding in ways that many didn't predict. But does this scenario change at all if Ukraine or a NATO alliance, more likely would be Ukraine, right? We always assume we can control Ukraine, which I don't think is a safe assumption. They may want to go into Russia. Does that change this calculation or scenario planning at all?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've given these advanced weapons to Ukraine under the condition that they not use them to attack Russian targets. Again, trying to control the escalation, trying to keep this a confined battle, as horrible as it is. But if you're Ukrainian and your leadership has been killed, right? Or tens of thousands of your people have been wiped out, you might take those M777s, you might take those HIMARS, and you just like move them right up there and go as deep into the headquarters, into Russia as you can to try to kill their leadership too, to try to get them. And so this is part of the thinking of why the administration has not given Ukraine ATACMS. For example, that system that can go 3, 4, 5 times what the HIMARS can do, and has kept back some of the advanced fighter aircraft that Ukraine wants because they're aware that if this thing gets out of control, they really can't stop Ukraine from doing this other than trying to persuade them.
Joe, can you just talk about the HIMARS for a second, because it's been a game changer. Months ago, people said if we give them HIMARS, Putin could fire a nuke. If we did this, Putin could fire a nuke. I feel like some of the oxygen has been sucked out of that fear mongering that, in my view, played into Putin's hand, right? We said if we enforced a no-fly zone, if we gave them too many weapons, if we gave them HIMARS. But HIMARS have been, I think it seems like a legitimate game changer. Can you talk about if that's true and why?
Absolutely. Look, first, all credit goes to the Ukrainian military and political leadership who have been just masterful in this, and to the morale and fighting spirit of the Ukrainian forces who have been incredible, and of course to the advantage that defenders have when it's their country that's been invaded. But these HIMARS and the drones, I would say, and the M777s, but the HIMARS in particular, have given Ukraine the ability to do scoot and shoot deep behind Russian lines. So they're mobile. You can move them into position. They are incredibly accurate. And coupled with the drones and the intelligence the U.S. is providing, you can pinpoint Russian headquarters. You can pinpoint ammunition dumps that are 40, 50 miles behind the front lines and hit them accurately with rounds of these very powerful rockets, and then move your artillery piece before the Russians can come after it with counter battery fire. And this, as far as I know, they have not lost any HIMARS. They, by the way, I don't know if you saw the story. The Ukrainians have made wooden HIMARS, decoys that look like HIMARS, to attract the Russian cruise missiles and drones and sort of draw down their supplies in this Potemkin HIMARS. So they've been extremely effective at this, and I don't think we've lost one of them. And so the Ukrainians are using them very effectively. And this is what's allowed them to get very close to being able to retake Cirincione, for example, and to knock out the transportation nodes, the supply nodes. I think as today, as we talk, there's reports that the Cirincione troops are now isolated, and that Cirincione commanders have been asking for permission to retreat, and Putin is now intervening and personally making battlefield decisions and telling them to stand their ground. This could be the next big event in this Ukraine war. If Cirincione falls, things are going to get very, very dicey for Putin.
So the Russians have lost more generals than the Ukrainians have HIMARS, I think, right? And
dozens of generals have been killed, tracked down, their communications picked up, drones or artillery sent in to kill them.
This is the other forward edge that I want to ask you to talk about, maybe pulling it all together. The other thing that is dramatically unfolding is unrest inside Russia.
Oh, yeah.
Now there are protests. The draft is underway. This can go sideways in a lot of ways internally. That could result in the toppling of Putin. Massive disruption internally. I guess the real question is, how safe are Russia's nukes if Putin doesn't have them, or if there's disruption in the leadership there? I think maybe the term loose nukes or whatever we call it. How safe are Russia's nukes if the Russian government gets overturned or there's massive political tumult there, while it's also happening in Iran now too, right? Which is another piece on this chessboard. But talk about that if you could, Joe. How dangerous and is that scenario?
Yeah. Well, it appears that in his desperation, Putin has done something he didn't want to do. He's doing a mobilization. Maybe it's partial, maybe it's full. It's at least a call up of 300,000, and it appears to be as incoherent, as incompetently handled as his invasion was. I mean, this again is showing the cracks in what we thought was the second best army in the world. They don't have a plan for this. They're not equipped to do what Putin has now commanded them to do. And you've heard, there's already stories Ukraine reported the day before we're recording this, that some of these conscripts have shown up. That means you're getting conscripts with under a week's training suddenly thrown into the front lines. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. But Putin is doing this, and he's stirring up more opposition to his rule than we've seen in years. And he's broken the basic pact he has with the Russian people, which was, you stay out of politics, you leave me alone, you let me run the government, and I will guarantee you security, stability, economic prosperity, which he has more or less delivered on. And now he's breaking that, and with the losses he's showing that are showing on the battlefield, his invulnerability, his image of being omnipotent and omniscient is cracking. And so you're seeing fissures open up, not just among the Russian population, but among the Russian leadership. You're seeing senior Russian parliamentarians, the head of the Federal Council, for example, the higher body of the Russian Duma, criticize not Putin, but the implementation of the mobilization. You're seeing mill bloggers speak out. You're seeing people on tightly controlled Russian TV speak out, saying it's time to sue for peace. This is a country where you're not even allowed to call this a war, and people are talking about coming to a diplomatic negotiated solution. So this is getting very, very dicey for Putin, which brings us back to the beginning of this. What's his move here? How does he prevent defeat? And one of those moves is nuclear. It's in play. It's real. I don't say this to scare people. It's just that, like you say, be vigilant, be alert, understand what's going on here so that you can properly respond. Finally, I got to give kudos to the Biden administration for how they've handled this. They have threaded this needle. They have given Ukraine a lot of material. They built up an international coalition to support him without provoking Putin so far.
Yeah. And they've opened the floodgates, like another 10 billion, I think. And I wasn't sure if they were going to do that. And you saw some resistance from some of the Trumper Republicans, the 10 or 15 that were voting against Ukraine support and have been, the same folks that frankly deny the election and conspiracy theorists. But I think Biden has kept the pedal down, and they've really managed this well. But just to put a point on that last question, Joe, if Putin dies, somebody in his leadership kills him. If somebody kills him, how safe are Russia's nukes?
I'm worried about this, because then you'd be back into the situation we confronted in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union unexpectedly collapsed. And there you were with loose nukes, and you who had, in a tightly controlled command structure, if the center falls, well, who has control? Who has command? Who can do this? I think, I don't want to overstate this, because I think in general these weapons are very tightly controlled. There's elite units guarding them. They're removed from the battlefield. They're not placed in the battlefield. They're in central storage, so, largely because of U.S. efforts in the 90s to do exactly this, to consolidate them, to bring them in, to use arms control agreements to draw down the arsenals. So we're much better off than we were in the 90s, but you'd be facing a similar situation, particularly if there were some field, even more ultra-nationalist elements that try to seize control. It could be worse than Putin. You got to keep that in mind. And if that kind of fighting breaks out, these nuclear weapons could become pawns in an internal Russian power struggle, and all kinds of scenarios open up that there is really no planning for.
And Joe, as we've seen in some of the contested areas, I would assume also that Russian nuke plants are also a vulnerability, right? I mean, if they're casualties on the battlefield, or they're left unsecure, or people in the military and other apparatus just start to quit, is that another scenario that we've got to be tracking on? We've seen it in some of the contested areas of Ukraine. Is it similarly going to be a concern if there's a government toppling inside of Russia?
You could see that. I mean, in Ukraine, we've seen Putin intentionally using the risk of a catastrophe at a nuclear power plant, the Zaporizhzhia power plant, as a form of nuclear terrorism, another part of this nuclear threat. Don't push me, or this terrible thing could happen. In the case of chaos in Russia, you could see that if there's a collapse of command, if there's a collapse of control, you could see operator error, undisciplined retreat from the nuclear power plants. That would not be high on my list, but it'd be in the mix of things you now have to start worrying about that you weren't worrying about before.
Joe, you are like a meteorologist predicting these crazy storms, and you've been so forward-looking. I got to ask. This is a lot, right? Uh, I've asked you this before, but how do you keep balance here when you're dealing with such serious stakes, and how do you keep yourself and your family? I don't know, calm is the right word, but how do you approach these conversations? You've got grandkids who. And Grandpa goes in the back and talks about World War III. And how do you manage that as a leader and as a family
Well,
man and as a voice in this country for yourself and others?
yeah, thanks for asking. Well, as we discussed, I do like bourbon.
Yeah.
Helps a lot. It's always nice to have a nice Italian red, at the end of a day. But part of it is just having a sense of history. I mean, you look over the last 77 years of the nuclear age, and we've come close before. And you have learned lessons from that. And part of it is luck, but part of it is policy skill and knowing that there are policies that can get us out of this. This is not this is not mandated. None of this has to go this way. And we've seen, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and like Reagan, Gorbachev, bitter enemies coming together, staring at the nuclear chasm and deciding to walk back. And so I think that's the kind of thing you see now. So I would bet that Joe Biden is talking to NATO leaders right now, and our general staff, and Lloyd Austin are talking to NATO leaders right now, because there's nothing automatic about a NATO response in the face of even a nuclear attack on NATO. You got 30 nations that have to agree to do this. Would Hungary agree? Would Poland agree to this? Would there be a pressure to pull back and surrender and say, okay, that's enough. Enough of this Ukraine war. We're done with it. So you got to start working all this in advance, and you got to start building up a global response to what Putin is doing. So you make it extremely hard for him to break this nuclear taboo, to cross this nuclear line. And that's why you see Secretary of State Blinken out in the talk shows talking about this, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talking about it. They're trying to alert people that this is a risk and be prepared for this, and convince Putin that this is not a winning move. That despite what Dmitry Medvedev says, we are not going to back down. You can't do this without suffering catastrophic consequences. We're not going to tell you what they are, but here's the list of the things we could do. So don't go there.
Well, I hope Putin would listen. He won't, but I hope Biden is listening to you. We go ahead. You had something.
Well, just that. Is there an exit ramp for Putin? And I don't mean some geostrategic, let him annex 20% of Ukraine territory. You're already seeing some op-eds saying that's the way out. No, I mean some kind of, he could stay alive. He won't be tried. He could take his billions and go someplace else, just leave power. Is there a way to have a soft landing for Putin? As despicable as that is, as untasteful as that is, if it results in the end of the war, you might agree to that kind of end game for him, that way out for him personally.
The end of the war is better than the end of the world, right?
Right.
And I think that that's the alternative. And if I were going to predict, or if I were going to request a soft landing for him, it'd be sharing a cell in Guantanamo with Donald Trump. But I don't think that that's going to happen. But in the meantime, you continue to be just such a valuable voice for this country, Joe. You're a voice of reason and perspective and insight. I wish every show had you on every day. But I'm thankful that you're back on this show again, and for all that you do. You're such a valuable public servant, and I'm just really grateful for your leadership and your wisdom and your balance. You're just helping us all understand this in a really powerful way. So thank you for all that you do, for taking some time away from your family, and for helping us through these rocky storms, my friend.
You're very kind. Thank you, Paul. And thank you for doing this. Thank you for keeping us vigilant and alert.
You got it, my friend. Let's stay vigilant and have a bourbon sometime in person soon.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.